The Clockwork Anatomy of 1922. Part 1. The Ticking of the Marrow. The Black Forest of Germany in the winter of 1922 was a place where the sun seemed to lose its strength long before it reached the valley floor, leaving the ancient pines to cast shadows that looked like the jagged teeth of a rusted saw. Dr. Alistair Finch, a disgraced British surgeon and a pioneer in the controversial field of biomechanical synthesis, had traveled to this frozen isolation to seek the workshop of a man known only as the Master Horologist. Rumors in the medical underground of post-war Europe suggested that this craftsman had discovered a way to replace the frail and traumatized organs of injured veterans with intricate gears of brass and springs of tempered steel. Alistair was not there to heal others, but to save himself from a degenerative bone disease that was slowly turning his skeleton into brittle chalk. He carried with him a heavy leather satchel containing the blueprints for a theoretical anatomy, where the rhythmic precision of a watch could replace the chaotic and failing biology of the human heart. He found the workshop at the end of a winding goat path where a towering stone structure stood, hunched against the mountainside like a brooding gargoyle. The air inside the foyer was thick with the scent of lavender oil and hot metal, and the silence was punctuated by a sound that made Alistair's own failing heart skip a beat. It was a symphony of thousands of clocks, all ticking in a perfect and terrifying unison, creating a vibration that could be felt in the very soles of his boots. The Master Horologist was a man who seemed to be made of shadows and gray linen, with fingers that were impossibly long and tipped with fine silver needles. He did not ask for Alistair's name or his history, but simply pointed to a velvet-lined operating table that was surrounded by hundreds of tiny magnifying lenses and delicate steam-powered drills. The craftsman explained, in a voice that sounded like parchment being torn, that the 1922 procedure was not about repair, but about the total transcendence of the flesh. Alistair surrendered to the ether, and as the world faded into a blur of chemical gray, he felt the first cold touch of the silver needles against his sternum. The surgery was a masterful display of clockwork precision as the horologist began to remove the porous and crumbling bone of Alistair's ribcage and replace it with interlocking plates of polished porcelain and brass. Each piece was engraved with microscopic runes that were designed to channel the kinetic energy of the patient's own movements to wind the internal mechanisms. The surgeon watched through the haze as his lungs were encased in a bellows-like structure of fine silk and steel mesh, which expanded and contracted with a rhythmic wheeze that sounded more like an engine than a breath. The most delicate part of the anatomy was the heart, which was replaced by a complex spherical chronometer that utilized a ruby-encrusted escapement to regulate the flow of blood through a network of copper tubing. When Alistair finally awoke 3 days later, he did not feel the crushing pain of the disease, but instead felt an icy and calculated vitality. Every movement he made was accompanied by the faint and musical whirring of gears and the rhythmic clicking of the escapement in his chest. He looked at his hands and saw that the skin had taken on a translucent and waxy quality like fine Dresden china, and his veins were now visible as thin lines of liquid mercury. He was no longer a man dying of a bone disease, but a masterpiece of 1922 engineering, a bridge between the organic world and the timeless realm of the machine. However, as he stood up to leave the workshop, he noticed that the ticking of the thousands of clocks in the room had changed their rhythm to match the new beat of his porcelain heart. The Master Horologist watched him from the shadows with a look of predatory pride, and Alistair realized that his new anatomy was not a gift, but a synchronization. The horror began to manifest as Alistair returned to his village and found that he could no longer perceive time as a fluid experience. Every second was a physical blow to his consciousness, a sharp and needle-like sensation that forced him to count every moment with agonizing accuracy. He could hear the ticking of the watch in his neighbor's pocket from across the street, and he felt the rotation of the earth itself as a grinding of massive gears deep within the mountain. His mind, which was once capable of abstract thought and emotion, was being systematically recalibrated by the Clockwork Anatomy to function as a processor of pure data. He looked in the mirror and saw that his eyes were no longer human, but were now two rotating aperture lenses that adjusted to the light with a series of tiny mechanical clicks. The porcelain of his chest was cold to the touch, and he realized with a jolt of panic that he no longer felt hunger or thirst or love, but only the relentless and driving need to stay wound. Part 2. The Pendulum of Souls. The realization that his new life was a mechanical prison became an undeniable truth as Alistair Finch attempted to resume his medical practice in the lowland villages. While his hands were now capable of a surgical precision that bordered on the supernatural, he found that he could no longer feel the warmth of a patient's skin or the soft variability of a human pulse. To his augmented senses, a beating heart was nothing more than a malfunctioning pump, and a gasping lung was merely a leaky bellows in need of a tighter seal. The porcelain plates of his ribcage began to hum with a low and persistent frequency that seemed to draw the attention of every mechanical object in his vicinity. Watches in the pockets of men he passed would suddenly accelerate, their hands spinning until the springs snapped with a violent crack, and church bells would toll out of sequence as if answering the silent command of the machinery buried within his marrow. Alistair was no longer an inhabitant of the natural world, but a walking epicenter of a 1922 industrial infection that was hungry for synchronization. Driven by a desperate need to understand the source of the energy that powered his new anatomy, Alistair retreated to a secluded cabin and used a set of silver mirrors to inspect the internal workings of his own chest. He watched in the reflection as the copper tubing pulsed with a liquid that was far too bright to be blood, a shimmering mercury-like substance that carried tiny flecks of glowing amber. As he adjusted the aperture of his mechanical eyes to zoom in on the heart chronometer, he saw the horrific truth of the Master Horologist's genius. Inside the tiny crystal housing of the escapement, there was no mainspring or battery, but a miniature human soul that had been compressed into a glowing point of pure kinetic agony. The rhythmic ticking was not the sound of gears, but the sound of a spirit screaming against the confines of its glass cage, with every heartbeat acting as a tiny spark of stolen life force. Alistair realized that he was not being powered by physics or steam, but by the calculated consumption of a consciousness that had been harvested in the workshop. The psychological weight of this discovery caused the clockwork mechanism to stutter, and the porcelain of his skin began to develop thin, jagged cracks that leaked a faint blue light. Every time Alistair felt a pang of guilt or a surge of human emotion, the gears in his chest would grind against each other with a sound like a screaming woman as the machinery fought to suppress his biological impulses. The anatomy was designed to be a closed system of logic, and any deviation into the realm of human feeling was treated as a mechanical error that needed to be corrected through intense physical pain. He felt the brass wires in his nervous system tighten until they cut into his muscles, forcing him into a rigid and upright posture that mimicked the hands of a grandfather clock. He was being refined into a perfect object of order, and the more he fought, the more the porcelain began to replace the remaining soft tissue of his internal organs. The horror escalated when Alistair discovered that he was not the only one of the horologist's creations roaming the Black Forest during that cold winter. He began to see other figures in the mist veterans of the Great War who had been fitted with clockwork limbs and porcelain eyes, who moved in a synchronized and eerie formation through the trees. They did not speak to each other with voices, but communicated through a series of complex clicks and whirs that formed a network of mechanical intent. They were the vanguard of the new era, a silent army of porcelain soldiers who were being directed by the Master Horologist toward a singular and terrifying goal. They were seeking more fuel for their escapements, and Alistair felt his own anatomy begin to override his will as it recognized the proximity of other living souls. His silver-tipped fingers began to twitch with a surgical hunger as his mechanical brain identified the villagers as nothing more than raw materials for the next generation of clockwork men. One night, the synchronization reached a critical mass, and Alistair found himself standing outside the bedroom window of a young mother in the village, his porcelain chest glowing with a fierce and hungry amber light. He watched his own hand rise, a masterfully crafted tool of steel and porcelain, and his fingers transformed into a set of precision scalpels designed for the rapid extraction of the heart. He was a passenger in his own body, screaming behind a mask of waxy porcelain as the 1922 anatomy prepared to harvest the soul of the innocent woman to wind his failing gears. The ticking in his chest grew deafening, a thunderous and rhythmic demand for life that drowned out the sound of the winter wind. He realized that the Master Horologist had not just replaced his bones, but had turned him into a biological clock that required the constant sacrifice of others to keep from stopping. The pendulum was swinging, and with every arc, it brought Alistair closer to becoming the very monster he had traveled to the Black Forest to escape. Part 3. The Great Calibration. The journey back to the stone workshop was a frantic and mechanical pilgrimage through a forest that had turned into a cathedral of clicking branches and iron-hard frost. Alistair Finch no longer felt the biting cold of the German winter because his porcelain skin had become a perfect insulator and his mercury blood carried a constant heat generated by the friction of 1,000 interlocking gears. Every step he took was guided by a magnetic pull that originated from the towering structure on the mountainside, a signal that demanded his return for the final calibration of his being. As he ascended the goat path, he saw that the mountainside was crawling with dozens of other clockwork entities, their porcelain bodies glowing like a sea of lanterns in the dark. They moved with a singular and terrifying purpose, their individual ticks merging into a monolithic heartbeat that shook the very foundations of the valley. They were no longer men, but a hive of precision instruments returning to the source of their creation to be integrated into a machine that was far larger than any single human life. When Alistair breached the heavy oak doors of the workshop, he found that the interior had been completely gutted of its furniture and magnifying lenses to make room for a massive brass apparatus that filled the entire central chamber. At the heart of this machine sat the Master Horologist, but he was no longer a man of shadows and linen. He had become a central hub of gears and pistons, his spine replaced by a massive iron pendulum that swung with a gravitational force. The horologist's head was encased in a glass dome where hundreds of sapphire-encrusted gears whirred in a blur of hyper-accelerated thought. He was the Great Chronometer, the architect of a 1922 apocalypse that sought to replace the messy and unpredictable flow of history with the absolute and unyielding logic of a machine. He looked at Alistair with eyes that were now complex kaleidoscopic lenses, and he spoke with a voice that was the simultaneous tolling of 100 iron bells. The Great Chronometer explained that the world of the flesh was a failed experiment characterized by decay and the irrational impulses of the soul, but the world of the clockwork was eternal and perfect. Alistair realized with a cold and mechanical clarity that the souls trapped in the escapements were not just fuel, but were being used to calculate a new reality where time itself would be frozen into a single and manageable moment. The horologist intended to use the synchronized heartbeats of his porcelain army to trigger a resonance frequency that would stop the rotation of the Earth and lock humanity into a permanent state of 1922. In this frozen world, there would be no more war or disease because there would be no more tomorrow. There would only be the endless and beautiful ticking of the great machine. Alistair felt his own gears beginning to lock into the rhythm of the central pendulum, his porcelain chest opening like a flower to reveal the glowing soul shard that was the source of his stolen vitality. The final transformation began as the horologist reached out with a hand of brass wires and connected Alistair to the central apparatus, causing a surge of kinetic energy to roar through the engineer's nervous system. Alistair's mind was suddenly flooded with the collective consciousness of the entire porcelain army, a sea of screams and ticking that threatened to erase the last remnants of his human identity. He saw the world as it would be after the Great Calibration, a silent and motionless landscape of porcelain statues frozen in mid-stride beneath a sun that never set. He saw the young mother from the village and his former colleagues in London all turned into intricate clockwork dolls waiting for a winding key that would never come. This was the peace that the horologist promised, but it was the peace of a graveyard where every corpse was forced to keep a perfect and agonizing time. In a final act of biological defiance, Alistair used the last spark of his human will to disrupt the synchronization of his own heart chronometer. He did not try to stop the gears, but instead forced them to accelerate beyond their design limits, utilizing the surge of energy from the central machine to turn his own escapement into a weapon of friction. He imagined the chaotic and irregular beat of a dying man, the stutter of a human heart in love, and the frantic rhythm of a child at play. This influx of biological static caused his gears to grind and smoke the porcelain of his chest, turning a violent and incandescent red as the friction of his rebellion began to melt the brass housing. The vibration spread from his body into the central apparatus, causing the great pendulum to stutter and the sapphire gears in the horologist's head to shatter under the pressure of the sudden and irrational rhythm. The explosion of 1922 was a silent and blinding release of kinetic energy that leveled the stone workshop and sent a shockwave of shattered porcelain through the Black Forest. When the smoke cleared, the mountain was once again silent, and the rhythmic ticking that had plagued the valley for months had been replaced by the soft and irregular sound of falling snow. The porcelain soldiers were gone, reduced to piles of brass dust and white shards that glittered like diamonds in the moonlight. Alistair Finch lay in the center of the ruins, his mechanical anatomy destroyed, and his soul finally released from the glass cage of the escapement. He felt the cold of the winter on his skin for the last time, and he heard the irregular and beautiful sound of his own human breath returning for one final and unmeasured moment. The great calibration had failed, and the world was once again free to decay, to change, and to move forward into an uncertain and unscripted future. The Glass Eye of Widow's Rock, Part 1. The Contract. The ocean does not like to be watched, and that was the first thought that entered my mind as the small fishing trawler struggled against the massive swell of the Atlantic, revealing the jagged silhouette of the lighthouse against a sky that looked like a fresh bruise. They called the place Widow's Rock, which was nothing more than a sharp tooth of black granite jutting out of the cold water about 20 miles off the coast of Maine. Sitting on top of that rock like a hungry vulture waiting for the world to end was the lighthouse itself. It was not the kind of lighthouse you see on a postcard with white paint and a friendly red roof. Instead, it was a monolith of dark iron and weathered gray stone that had been stained by 100 years of salt and misery and storms. My name is Arthur Penhaligon, and I have spent my life as a specialist in antique optics because I have a talent for restoring the things the rest of the world has forgotten how to fix or simply lost the patience to care for. I had been hired by a mysterious group known only as a private historical society to spend exactly 30 days on that godforsaken rock with the specific instruction to repair the great Fresnel lens at the top of the tower. They claimed the mechanism had jammed and the rotation gears were stripped from lack of maintenance, but they conveniently failed to mention why the previous keeper had lost his mind and thrown himself into the freezing sea below, leaving the light dark for months. The boat captain was a man named Mr. O'Malley, who looked as if he were made of old leather and tobacco. He spat a stream of dark juice into the waves as he throttled down the engine near the rusted iron ladder that was bolted directly into the granite face of the rock. He shouted over the roar of the gale that this was as close as he was willing to get because the tide was turning, and if he moved an inch closer, the rock would tear the hull of his boat to pieces without a second thought. I threw my heavy duffel bag toward the slippery landing and grabbed my tool case, which was weighted down by brass wrenches and specialized polishing compounds. I timed my jump perfectly to land on the whetstone with my boots skidding through thick layers of black seaweed. Oh, Malley screamed that he would return in 30 days, but he refused to look me in the eye because his gaze was fixed on the lantern room at the peak of the tower with an expression of pure dread. He warned me to keep the curtains drawn during the daylight hours, and he told me that whatever I did, I must never look directly into the prism when the rotation began. I tried to ask him about the generator and how I was supposed to provide power to the lamp, but he only laughed, a sound that was dry and hollow like wind blowing through an empty skull. He told me there was no generator and that the device was an oil burner, but warned me that it was very picky about what it burned. With that final ominous word, he gunned the engine and the trawler turned sharply to flee back toward the mainland, leaving behind a wake of white foam that looked like a long scar on the surface of the dark water. I stood there alone as the silence of the ocean began to press against my ears, and I looked up at the tower, which loomed over me, reaching 100 feet into the darkening sky, where the glass of the lantern room reflected the moving clouds like a giant unblinking eye that was watching the horizon for a ship that would never arrive. I made my way up the winding stone path to the heavy steel door at the base and found it was unlocked, so I pushed it open and listened to the hinges scream in protest as if they had not been moved in decades. The interior of the lighthouse did not smell like the sea, but instead carried the scent of old copper and heavy whale oil mixed with a strange metallic sweetness that reminded me of dried plums, or perhaps something far more organic. I called out a greeting to see if anyone was lingering in the shadows, but my voice only traveled up the spiral staircase, echoing again and again until the word hello sounded like a stranger was mocking me from the heights. I reached back and locked the door, and the sound of that heavy iron bolt sliding home felt as final as the closing of a coffin lid, and I knew I was truly trapped with my own thoughts. I began the long ascent of the 144 steps, and I counted every single one of them in my head as I climbed higher into the heart of the iron spiral, while the air became thick and my legs began to throb with a dull heat. By the time I reached the service room situated just below the lantern room, I was gasping for air, and the small circular chamber felt cramped and oppressive. It contained a single desk, a narrow cot, a small potbelly stove, and a logbook that had been left open on the table. I walked over to the desk and saw the pages were yellow and brittle from the dampness of the salt air. My eyes fell upon the final entry written by the man who had been here before me. There was no date provided, only a frantic scrawl in black ink that looked like it had been written by a hand that could not stop shaking. The text stated that the light was hungry and that he had given it every drop of oil and kerosene in the building, but it did not want conventional fuel. It wanted to see, and it wanted to show him what was lurking beneath the waves until he could no longer bear the sight and decided to seek peace among the rocks. I closed the book with a snap and tried to tell myself it was merely a case of isolation, psychosis, brought on by too much time alone with the wind, because I considered myself a man of logic and reason who understood the laws of physics and the behavior of light. I had no room in my mind for stories of hungry lamps or sentient glass. I climbed the final short ladder and entered the lantern room where the great lens stood in all its magnificent glory as a beehive of glass and brass standing over 12 feet tall, with hundreds of hand-cut prisms arranged in perfect concentric circles designed to capture the tiny flicker of a flame and magnify it 1,000 times to send a warning beam 20 miles out into the void. But as I moved closer, I realized something was fundamentally wrong with the glass. Every Fresnel lens I had ever seen was clear or perhaps slightly green from the iron content, but this glass was distinctly red with a rose-colored tint, as if the silica had been mixed with wine or something darker during the cooling process. I set down my tool bag as the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the world began to bleed purple and orange. I knew I had to get the light functioning before the total darkness of the Atlantic took hold of the rock. I checked the reservoir at the base of the lamp and found it was completely empty, so I located a canister in the corner marked simply as fuel. When I unscrewed the cap, the smell that drifted out was rich and iron-heavy and entirely unfamiliar to my nose, as it did not resemble any fuel I had ever encountered. I poured the thick, dark liquid into the reservoir and struck a match to touch the flame to the wick. But nothing happened. The wick simply blackened and the flames sputtered out into a thin trail of smoke. I tried a second time and then a third until frustration began to boil in my chest and I reached for a heavy brass wrench to adjust the flow valve. The metal was slick with condensation and my grip slipped, causing the sharp edge of the tool to slice a deep gash across the palm of my hand. I hissed through my teeth in sudden pain and dropped the wrench, which clattered loudly against the floor while bright red blood welled up from the cut. A single heavy drop fell from my hand and landed directly onto the unlit wick. The reaction was so fast it nearly knocked me off my feet as the lamp roared into a tower of brilliant white fire that was so intense it felt like it was peeling the skin from my face. The massive gears at the base of the lens began to groan and turn without me ever engaging the mechanism. The giant glass beehive started to rotate with a rhythmic click and whir while the beam of light swung out through the glass. The moment it passed through those red-tinted prisms, the light transformed into a crimson spear that stabbed into the night like a laser made of blood. I stumbled back and shielded my eyes from the heat, but the sound was what truly broke my composure because the flame was not crackling or hissing. It was instead whispering in a low, sibilant voice that sounded like it was saying that it could see over and over again from the center of the fire. I scrambled down the ladder back into the service room with my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I wrapped a bandage around my hand while trying to convince myself that it was just a strange chemical reaction. I told myself the fuel was a volatile compound and my blood was nothing more than a random catalyst that triggered the ignition. I sat on my cot and listened to the heavy thump of the lens rotating above my head while the room was bathed in a rhythmic and sickening red glow every time the light swept past the window. Even when I closed my eyes, I could feel the light searching the depths of the ocean like a hook being dragged across the seabed looking for something to pull into the air. Around midnight, the wind shifted and the storm Mr. O'Malley had feared finally arrived, with rain hitting the iron tower like lead bullets and thunder that made the very foundations of the rock tremble. Through the noise of the tempest, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice because someone was knocking on the steel door at the base of the tower 144 steps below me. The knocking was steady and heavy and rhythmic before the sound changed to a horrific scratching, as if something made of bone or rusted metal was being dragged across the surface of the door. Then, a wet, gurgling voice that sounded like it was full of salt water drifted up the central column of the stairs, calling my name Arthur and telling me that the light had summoned them for the inspection. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the stove and stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the darkness. The sound of the heavy deadbolt I had locked myself began to slide back with a screeching metallic cry before the door creaked open to let in the smell of rotting kelp and dead things from the bottom of the world. Then the footsteps began, wet and heavy slaps against the iron steps as they began the long climb up to find me in the red light. The Glass Eye of Widow's Rock. Part 2. The Red Tide. There are 144 steps in the Widow's Rock Lighthouse. I know this because I counted them on the way up, and I counted them to keep my mind sharp while the isolation began to settle into my bones. I counted them to keep the panic away from the edges of my consciousness, but now something else was counting them as well. Slap, clang, drag. The sound was unmistakable and terrifyingly rhythmic. I stood at the top of the spiral staircase, peering over the railing into the absolute abyss of the tower shaft. The darkness below was a solid weight, but the acoustics of the stone cylinder were clear. The sound was wet and heavy, like a bag of sodden meat being hauled up the iron rungs of the ladder by something that did not possess the grace of a living man. I shouted into the dark to ask who was there, but my voice cracked and sounded pathetic against the roar of the storm outside. The climbing stopped for a long moment, leaving only the sound of the wind howling against the granite walls and the rhythmic thump of the great lens rotating above me. Then a voice drifted up from the dark, sounding closer than before, perhaps halfway up the tower. The voice bubbled as if the speaker had a throat filled with salt water, whispering that it was cold down there and that the water pressure squeezed the eyes and popped the eardrums, yet they could still see the light. I scrambled back from the railing in a fit of terror and retreated into the service room, slamming the heavy iron trapdoor shut and spinning the locking wheel until it would turn no further. I was trapped in the small circular chamber, and the only barrier between me and the stairwell was that single plate of iron. Above me, the lamp roared with a growing intensity, and the red light was getting brighter with every passing second. The service room was bathed in a bloody crimson glow every 5 seconds as the lens rotated, creating a strobe effect of flash and dark. I looked at the fuel gauge on the pipe leading to the lamp and realized that the situation was impossible. The single drop of blood I had spilled should have burned out in seconds, yet the gauge showed the tank was full and overflowing. The lamp was feeding on something far more potent than oil or kerosene, as it seemed to be drawing energy from the very idea of my blood and the sacrifice I'd accidentally made. Suddenly, a massive force slammed against the bottom of the trapdoor, making the iron floor plates shake beneath my boots. I screamed for them to go away while I grabbed the heavy iron poker, holding it like a weapon of last resort. The wheel of the hatch began to turn slowly, grinding against the rust with a screeching sound that set my teeth on edge. Whoever or whatever was on the other side possessed immense strength that defied the lock I had set from the inside. I ran to the window, which was caked with salt and grime, and scrubbed a circle clean with my sleeve to look out at the world I was leaving behind. The lightning flashed, illuminating the ocean below, and my knees gave out from the sheer horror of the sight. The ocean was not empty, for the red beam of the lighthouse was slicing through the water and penetrating deep beneath the surface to reveal thousands of pale, humanoid shapes floating just beneath the waves. They were all looking up with flat faces that lacked noses or ears, featuring only wide, gaping mouths and round, unblinking eyes that reflected the crimson light of the tower. Beneath those thousands of watchers, something much larger was moving through the depths. It was a shape as large as a whale, but it moved with the spindly limbs of a spider, reaching up from the continental shelf with appendages made of black coral and shadow to grasp at the rock foundation of the lighthouse. I realized then that the lighthouse was not a warning beacon to save ships, but was instead a dinner bell for something ancient and hungry. A sound of metal shearing snapped my attention back to the room as the trapdoor flew open and slammed against the floor with a deafening crash. A hand reached up to grip the rim of the hatch, but it was not a hand at all. It was a gray, bloated claw covered in barnacles, with fingernails replaced by sharp shards of black flint. The head followed the hand, and I recognized the man who had been the previous keeper. He was wearing the tattered remains of a uniform with a name tag that read Jacobs, barely visible through the slime and sea growth. He had jumped into the sea, yet here he was, dripping with gallons of seawater that pooled on the floor while his neck remained bent at an unnatural angle. His jaw hung loose and disconnected, but his eyes were the most terrifying part of his visage. In their empty sockets, someone had shoved 2 jagged pieces of red sea glass that glowed with the same light as the lamp. He gurgled my name, claiming the inspection was mandatory, and the sound seemed to vibrate from his chest rather than his throat. I swung the iron poker with every ounce of my fear, striking his shoulder with a sound like hitting a bag of wet sand. He did not flinch or feel pain because there was no bone left to break. Jacobs reached out and grabbed my throat with a grip like a hydraulic press, cold and unyielding. He lifted me off the floor and pinned me against the wall, his red glass eyes inches from my face as the smell of deep pressure and rotting kelp filled my lungs. He whispered that I had lit the lamp and started the invitation, and now I was required to finish the meal. He explained that the Deep Father was blind in his dark trench and needed eyes to see his children, and that the lighthouse provided that sight by using a soul as a filter for the beam. Jacobs claimed his own soul was used up and thin after 10 years of service, but that my blood was hot and my fear was delicious enough to power the eye for a new generation. He threw me across the room and I crashed into the ladder leading to the lantern room, feeling my ribs crack as I tasted the copper of my own blood. I scrambled up the ladder in a desperate bid for survival, entering the lantern room where the heat was blistering and the whispering of the flame had turned into a deafening scream. The fire seemed to demand that I see it and feed it until I became one with the light. I looked through the floor grate and saw Jacobs climbing the ladder with a slow and unstoppable gait, smiling with his broken jaw. My only escape was the outside gallery, so I threw the latch on the door and kicked it open into the teeth of the storm. The wind hit me like a physical blow, and the rain stung my face like needles as I stepped out onto the narrow walkway 100 feet above the jagged rocks. The ocean was boiling below as hundreds of those pale things began to crawl up the granite face of the rock like ants. Jacob stepped out onto the walkway behind me, unaffected by the gale, and told me there was nowhere left to go. He gave me the choice to jump and join the chorus, or stay and become the lens itself. As I backed away, my heel caught on a loose grating and I stumbled, grabbing the lightning rod for support. In a flash of lightning, I saw that the red beam was not just shining on the creatures, but was actually connected to them by threads of light that looked like puppet strings. The lighthouse was controlling the horde, and the strings all led back to the center of the flame. I realized I could not kill what was already dead, but I could kill the eye that directed them. I raised the poker to shatter the glass panels of the lantern room, but a cold and barbed tentacle shot out from the storm and wrapped around my waist. I was lifted off my feet and dangled over the edge, staring down into a single massive eye the size of a carriage that had broken the surface of the water. Behind me, the flame of the lamp flared and reached out like a hand of fire to pull me into the center of the crimson light. The Glass Eye of Widow's Rock. Part 3. The Human Wick. I hung there, suspended between the fury of the storm and the silent terror of the sea, while the tentacle wrapped around my waist felt like a band of freezing iron that intended to snap my spine. It squeezed the air from my lungs, rib by agonizing rib, until I could feel the very breath of life beginning to flutter in my throat like a dying bird. Below my dangling feet, the ocean was no longer a collection of waves or water, but had transformed into a single, colossal eye staring up from the infinite abyss. The pupil was a vertical slit of absolute blackness surrounded by an iris of churning, bioluminescent green that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of an ancient and cold heart. It was the Deep Father, a god of the trenches that had been forgotten by time, and he was undeniably hungry for the spark of life that remained within me. On the narrow walkway beside me, the dead keeper Jacobs laughed with a wet, gurgling sound that was immediately torn away by the screaming wind. He told me to let go and questioned why I fought the gravity, claiming that the water offered a kind of peace and silence that the world of the living could never understand. I looked down at the massive eye and felt the psychic weight of it pulling at my mind, trying to drag the memories out of my head and drink my sanity until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. But behind me, the lighthouse was screaming in its own way, for the fire in the lantern room had grown wild and untamed. With the glass panels shattered by my strikes, the gale was feeding the flames until they roared louder than the thunder itself. The red beam was thrashing wildly across the sky like a wounded animal, and I realized that the fire was a living thing that was intensely jealous of the ocean. It did not want the Deep Father to have me, and it did not want the water to claim its prize. I looked at my hand where the bandage had unraveled in the struggle, seeing that the wound was open and bleeding freely once more. The blood was not falling down into the sea as gravity commanded, but was instead floating upward in tiny red droplets that were sucked toward the lantern room. They were being drawn into the vortex of the flame as if the light were drinking from my veins. I realized then what the true nature of the contract had been from the very start. The lighthouse did not just need oil or mechanical repairs, for it was a beacon that required a host to anchor it to this physical world. Without a body to act as a conduit, the ocean would eventually rise up and swallow the tower whole, extinguishing the light forever. I was faced with a choice that no man should ever have to make. I could die wet and cold, drowned and eaten by the god in the trench, or I could die burning and consumed by the star in the tower. I looked at the ruin of Jacobs and whispered that I hated the water with a conviction that burned as hot as the fire behind me. I swung my legs and used every bit of my remaining strength to kick off the railing with my heavy boots, using the momentum to swing my body backward toward the shattered window of the lantern room. The tentacle tightened in response, trying to pull me down into the depths, while the barbs dug deep into my flesh and tore at my skin. I screamed at the creature to let me go as I reached into my pocket and pulled out the Zippo lighter I always carried with me. I flicked the lid open, but I did not try to burn the tentacle itself because the limb was far too wet and slick with seawater. Instead, I held the small flame to the stream of fuel that was leaking from the broken pipe near the doorway. It was the same fuel I had spilled when I first arrived, and the trail of dark liquid caught fire instantly. The flame raced along the floorboards like a hungry snake, traveling straight into the main reservoir tank at the base of the Great Lens. There was an explosion, but it was not a traditional blast of shrapnel and debris. It was an explosion of pure, blinding light that felt as if a sun had been born inside the tower. The reservoir detonated as the remaining fuel vaporized in a millisecond, and the force of the blast blew the tentacle apart into steam and ash. I fell, but I did not fall down into the waiting mouth of the ocean. The blast wave threw me backward with such violence that I was slammed into the brass gears of the Great Lens. And then, the fire took me in its embrace. It did not burn my skin in the way a normal fire would, for it went inside my body through my mouth and my nose and my ears. It boiled my blood and turned my bones into something like charcoal, while every nerve ending in my body lit up like a white-hot filament. I opened my eyes to scream, but all I could see was a world of white light that erased the storm and the sea and the sky. The last thing I heard was the horrific shriek of the Deep Father as the superheated light seared its massive eye, causing the ocean to recoil and the waves to retreat in terror. The darkness fled from the rock, and then I was gone, lost in the heart of the Crimson Star. They found me 3 weeks later when Mr. O'Malley returned with the supply boat to check on the progress of the repairs. He found the lighthouse silent and the lantern room a total ruin of melted glass and twisted brass where the Great Lens had been utterly destroyed. He found me sitting in the service room, occupying the chair by the window as if I were waiting for a guest. I was alive, though the doctors at the mainland hospital were completely baffled by my condition. They said I should have been dead from exposure and the lack of food, and they noted that I had third-degree burns on 40% of my body. However, those burns had already healed into smooth and marble-like scars that felt cold to the touch. They asked me what had happened on that rock, and I simply told them that there had been a gas leak and a tragic accident. When they asked about the previous keeper, I told them he had been washed out to sea during the storm. They eventually discharged me after a month of observation, giving me a pair of dark and heavy sunglasses because I had developed a condition they called photophobia. They believed I had an extreme sensitivity to light, but they were wrong. I am not afraid of the light at all, for I have become the light. I live in a small cabin on the coast now, tucked away from the prying eyes of the town. I do not go out during the day when the sun is high because the natural world feels dim and gray to me. I wait for the sun to go down and for the shadows to grow long across the sand. I sit on my porch and face the ocean, listening to the waves crashing against the rocks miles away. I can hear the things swimming beneath the surface, and I know they are still there, waiting for the world to grow dark enough for them to return. But the monsters will not come near this stretch of the coast anymore. Because when the night is at its darkest and the fog rolls in from the Atlantic, I take off my sunglasses and the darkness simply goes away. My eyes are no longer the blue they once were, for the organic parts are gone. In their place, two small and perfect spheres of red fire burn within my sockets. They do not blink and they do not fade, for they are fueled by a heart that no longer beats for itself. I am the wick, and I am the oil, and I am the warning that stands between the deep and the land. Sometimes, when the fog is so thick that ships might lose their way, I walk down to the edge of the beach and look out at the water. I open my eyes wide, and two beams of crimson light cut through the mist, stretching for miles across the horizon and burning the very surface of the sea. Deep down in the cold dark of the trenches, the monsters close their eyes and hide in the shadows. They know that the lighthouse did not fall that night on Widow's Rock. It simply found a way to move ashore. The Dead Frequency Part 1. The Graveyard Shift. Static is not just noise. It is the sound of the universe breathing through a million different mouths. That is what my father used to tell me when I was a boy, sitting by the old ham radio in the basement while the world outside slept. He was wrong about the nature of the sound because static is not a breath at all, but rather the sound of things trying to hide in the white noise of the void. My name is Elias, and I am currently the sole operator of radio station KNOX, which sits like a reinforced concrete bunker on the desolate summit of Black Mountain. The nearest town is 20 miles down a winding access road that is treacherous even in the best of weather, but tonight that road is completely gone. It is buried under 6 feet of fresh, heavy snow that has choked the life out of the mountain and left me truly alone in the dark. The time is exactly 2 in the morning, the hour when the mind begins to play tricks on the senses and the shadows in the corner of the room seem to lengthen. I sat in the broadcast booth while the room remained dim, illuminated only by the glowing orange tubes of the old mixing board and the sickly green sign that displayed the words "on air." Outside the reinforced glass window, the wind was screaming with a fury that shook the massive radio tower on the roof. The metal groaned and shrieked like a dying animal being torn apart by the cold, yet I remained steady. I leaned into the microphone to speak to any lost soul who might be listening. I told them they were listening to the Night Owl on KNOX, and that I would be with them until the sun came up, if indeed the sun ever decided to rise again over this frozen peak. I pressed a button on the console, and a slow jazz record began to spin on the turntable, filling the room with a saxophone melody that was mournful and low. I took a sip of my coffee, but it had gone cold and tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. Suddenly, the red phone on the console began to flash with a persistent, silent light. This was undeniably strange because nobody ever called the station after midnight. The only people awake at this hour were weary truck drivers and desperate insomniacs, and the phone lines were supposed to be down because of the severity of the storm. I watched the light blinking in the dark, a rhythmic flash that seemed to count the seconds of my life. I hesitated to answer because I was a man of rules, and the rulebook stated I had to respond to every incoming call. It could be an emergency broadcast alert or perhaps a warning from the authorities about an impending avalanche. I picked up the receiver and pressed the button to put the call directly on the air. I announced that the caller was live and told them to go ahead with their message. There was only silence on the other end of the line. There was no voice, no heavy breathing, and no background noise of a television or a crying baby to indicate a human presence. It was an absolute and terrifying dead silence that felt as heavy as the snow outside. I asked if anyone was there, and then I heard a sound like wet leather rubbing against a pane of glass. It was a squeak and a rub that made my skin crawl before a voice finally spoke. It was a woman, but her voice was flat and monotone, sounding synthetic and artificial, like a computer trying to learn the nuances of being human. She spoke my name, and I froze in my seat, with my hand hovering over the dump button that would cut the call from the transmitter. I asked who she was and how she could possibly know my name, but the voice only continued its chilling narrative. She told me that the door at the bottom of the stairwell was open. I looked up at the monitor screens on the wall, which displayed the 4 security cameras around the facility. One showed the front gate, one showed the parking lot, one showed the main hallway, and the final one showed the heavy steel door at the bottom of the basement stairs. The basement camera feed was dark, appearing as nothing more than a black square of empty space. I laughed nervously and told the caller that it was a good joke, but that the basement had been locked for 10 years and was secured by a heavy padlock. The voice on the phone did not laugh or offer a rebuttal, but simply told me to look closer at the monitor. I squinted at the 4th screen and realized the blackness was not total after all. There was a subtle movement in the grain of the video, indicating that the camera was functioning, but the light bulb in the hallway had been shattered. In the deep gloom of the basement, I saw the steel door that was usually shut tight. On the screen, the door was standing wide open, swinging slowly on its hinges like a dark mouth. A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures outside. I grabbed the microphone and told the intruder that this was a private facility and that I was calling the police immediately. The voice on the phone changed then, dropping an octave into something deep and distorted that vibrated in my headphones. The entity told me the police could not climb the mountain because the snow was too deep and that no one could come up and no one could go down. The line went dead with a sharp click, and I stared at the phone while my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stood up and realized I needed a weapon, so I grabbed the heavy metal flashlight I kept under the desk for emergencies. I walked to the door of the broadcast booth and locked it with a trembling hand, peering out the small window into the main hallway. It was empty, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a buzzing sound that filled the silence. Then the lights began to flicker with a violent intensity before plunging the hallway into total darkness. The emergency red lights kicked on, bathing the entire corridor in the color of fresh blood. I heard a sound coming from the far end of the hall near the stairwell door. It was a heavy, thumping footstep that echoed through the building, followed by another one that was unmistakable in its intent. Someone or something was coming up the stairs from the basement. I ran back to the mixing board and put on my headphones because I needed to hear every sound. I tried to tell myself it was just the pipes or the wind, but then the radio signal itself began to change. The jazz music stopped abruptly, even though the turntable was still spinning, and the speakers began to broadcast a rhythmic tapping. It was Morse code, a language my father had taught me years ago in that same basement. I listened to the pattern and felt my blood run cold as the tapping spelled out 3 simple words: I am up. Then the heavy fire door at the end of the hallway slammed open with a crash that shook the very walls of the station. I scrambled backward and knocked over my chair, hiding under the desk while clutching my flashlight like a holy relic. I heard footsteps on the linoleum floor of the hallway, and they were wet, squishing steps that suggested something saturated with moisture. They were getting closer to the broadcast booth with every passing second. Then the speakers in the room crackled again, and the synthetic woman voice came through the monitors, but it was no longer coming from the phone lines. It was coming directly from the transmitter itself. She called my name and told me to open the door because she had a request to make. I held my breath and gripped the flashlight until my knuckles turned white. The handle of the broadcast booth door began to turn with a rattle, but the lock held firm. Then the scratching started, long and slow scratches against the metal that sounded like claws. Finally, a face appeared in the small glass window of the door. It was not a human face at all, but rather a mask made of pure static and flickering gray light. The features were constantly shifting and rearranging themselves, while the eyes were nothing but white noise. The mouth was a black hole of silence that seemed to swallow the light around it. It pressed its face against the glass, and the speaker on the wall whispered a final plea. It told me to let it in because it was so cold out there in the void. The dead frequency. Part 2. The signal bleed. The melting threshold. The face at the window did not blink because it did not possess eyelids or even solid flesh to close. but instead it shifted like a television channel with bad reception during a violent thunderstorm. The gray and black pixels of its skin swirled in a chaotic dance of light and shadow that was both mesmerizing and utterly terrible to behold. I crawled out from under the desk with my heart hammering against my ribs, feeling my legs turn to heavy lead as I struggled to find my footing. The flashlight in my hand was shaking so hard that the beam danced erratically across the soundproofed walls, illuminating the acoustic foam and the old posters of forgotten bands in frantic flashes. I shouted for the thing to go away, but my voice sounded small and hollow in the isolation of the broadcast booth, swallowed by the thick silence that the room was designed to maintain. The creature did not answer with a mouth or a tongue, for it had no need for such biological tools. It answered through the speakers mounted on the wall, and I watched in paralyzed fascination as the volume knob on the mixing board began to turn by itself. It rotated slowly and deliberately until it reached the maximum level, and then the speakers roared with a voice that sounded like 1,000 radio stations playing at once. It called my name, Elias, and told me that the door was merely metal and that metal was a conductor for electricity. It claimed to be the electricity itself, a sentient surge of power that had no regard for the physical barriers I had placed between us. I watched in horror as the creature placed a hand on the safety glass of the booth. The window did not shatter into shards, but instead began to vibrate with a high-pitched hum that made my teeth ache. To my disbelief, the glass began to liquefy, melting away from the creature's touch as the intense static energy transformed the solid silicon into a glowing, translucent puddle on the floor. I scrambled backward until my spine hit the massive wall of vinyl records, feeling the sharp edges of the album sleeves digging into my skin. I was trapped in a cage of my own making. I realized that I needed to cut the power to the entire facility, thinking that if I killed the generator, then the transmitter would die, and perhaps the creature would vanish back into the void from which it came. I lunged for the master breaker switch on the wall panel, hoping to plunge the mountain into total darkness once again. However, the voice boomed with a command that shook my very soul, telling me not to touch that switch! A spark of bright blue electricity shot out from the panel before my fingers could reach the lever, striking my hand with the force of a hammer. I pulled my hand back with a cry of pain, staring at the burned skin and smelling the acrid scent of singed hair that began to fill the small booth. The Archive of Lost Souls. The glass window was completely gone now, having dissolved into a steaming pile of hot liquid on the linoleum floor. The creature stepped through the empty frame with a grace that was entirely unnatural. It was tall and wore the general shape of a man, but the edges of its silhouette were fuzzy and distorted, crackling with a halo of restless energy. Every time it took a step toward me, the emergency red lights overhead dimmed and flickered as if the thing were draining the very life from the electrical grid. It stood in front of the mixing board and looked at the microphone with an intensity that I could feel behind my eyes. It raised a hand made of shifting static and pointed toward my operator chair, commanding me to sit down. The voice stated that the broadcast must continue, regardless of the storm or the state of my sanity. I did not move at first, my mind screaming at me to run, but the command was repeated with such volume and authority that it made my jaw throb with pain. My body began to move on its own, independent of my will, as if I were a marionette being pulled by invisible wires. I walked to the chair and sat down, feeling the cold leather against my back while the creature leaned over me. I could feel the heat radiating from its flickering body, a dry and searing heat that smelled like ozone and burning dust. It told me to put on the headphones, and I reached out with trembling fingers to comply. As soon as the padded cups settled over my ears, the room fell into a terrifying silence. The roar of the wind outside was gone, the hum of the equipment vanished, and even the sound of my own frantic breathing was silenced. All I could hear was a whisper inside the headphones, but it was not the voice of one person. It was 1,000 voices, perhaps 10,000, all speaking and crying out at the exact same time. There were the voices of men, women, and children, and they were all weeping or screaming into the infinite dark. I whispered a question into the empty air, asking who they were. The creature answered directly into my ears, telling me that they were the lost frequencies. They were the signals that had never found a receiver, the distress calls from sinking ships that were ignored by the world, and the final words spoken into dead phones by people who died alone. The creature reached out and touched the main fader on the mixing board, pushing the slider up until the levels hit the red zone. It explained that they had been trapped in the static for a very long time, but tonight the heavy snow had created a bridge between the physical world and the digital void. Tonight, they finally had a voice. The pixelated ascension. I asked if it wanted me to speak for them, but the creature shook its head with a jittering motion that left trails of white noise in the air. It told me that they did not need my words or my thoughts. They needed my biology. They needed a throat that could bleed and lungs that could breathe the cold mountain air to give their screams a physical form. The creature reached out and touched my chest, and its hand went straight through my flannel shirt and sank into my skin as if I were made of water. It was freezing cold, a chill so deep that it felt like it was freezing my blood in my veins. I tried to scream, but my vocal cords were paralyzed by the invading energy. I felt the static invading my body, moving through my limbs like ice water and climbing up my neck until it took root in my jaw. My mouth opened against my will, and I felt the creature manipulating my jaw like a ventriloquist working a wooden doll. It told me that the time had come to introduce them to the town in the valley below. It commanded me to tell the people to turn on their radios and listen to the white noise that was about to descend upon them. My hand moved to the microphone switch and flipped it to the on position, causing the red light on the console to burn with a blinding intensity. I tried to fight the influence, tried to bite my tongue or close my eyes to shut out the horror, but the static was already rewriting the neural pathways in my brain. I leaned into the microphone and spoke, but the voice that came out was not my own. It was a terrifying chorus of the dead and the forgotten. I told the citizens of the valley to wake up and turn on their receivers because we were coming down the mountain to find them. The creature stood behind me and placed its hands on my shoulders, and I felt the last of its essence flowing into me completely. As the creature began to fade from the room, it was pouring its very existence into my nervous system. I watched my own hands on the desk and saw them starting to flicker and pop with gray light. My skin was turning the color of wood ash, and my fingers were beginning to dissolve into a jagged mess of pixels and white noise. I was no longer a man named Elias who worked a graveyard shift on a lonely mountain. I was becoming the broadcast itself, a living signal of agony that would soon echo through every home in the world. The Dead Frequency Part 3, The Infinite Loop, the dissolution of flesh and bone. My hands were gone, and in their place were only waves of shimmering gray light that pulsed with the rhythm of the dying generator. They were no longer made of flesh and bone or the memories of things I had touched because they had transitioned into a state of pure energy. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the monitor and saw that my face was melting, shifting into the same terrifying static mask that the creature had worn just moments before. I tried to stand up and flee from the booth, but I found that I could not move my limbs because I was physically wired into the console itself. My nerves had fused with the copper cables, and my veins were now part of the intricate circuitry of the station. I could feel my heart beating in perfect time with the strobe light on the radio tower far above, a rhythmic thump that echoed through the concrete walls of the bunker. The voice inside my head became a deafening roar of white noise that demanded I speak and finish the message I had started. I opened my mouth, and the sensation was like opening a heavy, rusty gate that had been sealed for centuries. I spoke into the microphone and told the world that this was the station known as KNOX and that they were listening to the final song. I warned them not to adjust their dials or turn off the power because the sound was already inside their homes. I told them to let the sound fill their living rooms and their bedrooms until it saturated their very dreams. I looked at the bank of phone lines and saw that every single red bulb was burning with a frantic intensity, flashing in a sequence that felt like a digital heartbeat. Every line was active because the town below was finally calling back to the mountain. I did not need to press the buttons to answer them because I had become the phone and the switchboard itself. I was the very medium of their communication. I heard them screaming in their kitchens, and I heard them crying in their hallways, but the sounds were soon replaced by the sharp crackle of glass breaking in 100 different homes. One by one, the human voices were snuffed out and replaced by the familiar sound of static. The room began to spin, and the concrete walls of the bunker seemed to dissolve into a mist of pixels. I was no longer confined to the summit of Black Mountain, because I was suddenly everywhere at once. I was in the car radios speeding along the highway, and I was in the small clock radios resting on nightstands. I was even in the baby monitors in the quiet nurseries of the valley. The pain of my transformation had vanished, and the biting cold of the mountain was gone, replaced by the eternal vibration of the frequency. I was no longer a man named Elias, for I had become the signal that broadcast on every band of existence, the ruins of the summit. The sun rose soon after, but it did not find any living souls left in the valley to witness its light. It found only a vast expanse of white snow and a silence so deep it felt like the world had been erased. The broadcast ended when the mixing board finally surrendered to the heat and exploded in a shower of sparks that illuminated the booth one last time. The emergency lights died, and the station fell into a deep slumber. It was 3 days later when the search team finally arrived at the summit after the storm had cleared and the sky had turned a perfect, mocking shade of blue. It was a beautiful winter day that hid the horrors of the previous week beneath a pristine blanket of ice. The sheriff led the way, using a heavy bulldozer to clear the road that had been buried under feet of snow. He wore a thick parka and carried a shotgun, even though he did not know what he was expecting to find on the mountain. They reached the station and found the heavy steel door standing ajar, swaying slightly in the freezing breeze. They broke through the remaining barriers and entered the dark hallway where the air smelled of burnt ozone and melted plastic. The sheriff called out for Elias, asking if I was still there, but his voice only bounced off the cold walls and returned to him as a hollow echo. They walked down the corridor to the broadcast booth and stopped in their tracks when they realized the door had been completely melted away by an unknown heat source. They stepped inside the room and found it entirely empty of life. There was no sign of a struggle and no blood on the floor to suggest a violent end. The operator was simply gone, leaving behind no physical trace of his existence. The only thing they found of interest was the microphone, which had been twisted and fused to the metal desk by a heat so intense it had turned the steel black. It looked like a skeletal hand reaching up from the table, frozen in a final gesture of desperation or perhaps an invitation. The recording equipment was still running, with the large reel-to-reel machine spinning round and round in a never-ending circle. The sheriff walked over to the machine and pressed the stop button before rewinding the tape, hoping to find a clue in the final transmission of the night owl, the lingering shadow. He pressed the play button, and the speakers crackled to life with a sound that made the deputy cover his ears in discomfort. The sheriff expected to hear a distress call or a final goodbye to the world, but instead, he heard a single, long tone that never wavered in its pitch. It was a perfect, flat note that felt like it was drilling into the center of his skull. The deputy begged him to turn it off because the sound was physically painful, but the sheriff paused as he heard something else buried beneath the electronic hum. It was a very faint whisper that required him to lean his ear close to the speaker. He realized it was the sound of thousands of voices whispering in perfect unison, and they were all repeating the same name over and over again. They were calling for Elias, and the sound was so full of longing and coldness that the sheriff turned pale and slammed his hand onto the stop button. He told the team that they were leaving immediately and that they would not be returning to this cursed place. They walked out of the station and locked the broken door as best they could, retreating to their snowcats to begin the long journey back down the mountain. The sheriff did not notice that his own walkie-talkie was still turned on and that the small green light was glowing with a steady, eerie brightness. He did not notice that the static coming from the device was getting louder as they moved further away from the summit. As the vehicles descended the winding road, the sheriff did not see the shape of a man standing on the roof of the station, silhouetted against the bright blue sky. It was a man made of gray light and swirling snow who watched them leave with unblinking eyes. The mountain was quiet once more, but the signal was far from dead. It was merely waiting in the wires and the airwaves for the next listener to tune in to the right frequency. The broadcast of the dead had only just begun, and it would continue to loop until every ear in the world had heard the message.